Good evening, everyone. Good evening to all members of ICOMOS India National Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness. Hope you all are doing well, and it's so nice to see you after so long. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Priyanka Panjwani, the coordinator of NSC Risk Preparedness, and along with my co-coordinator Shahzad, I'm happy to welcome you on the second Saturday of a very hot month of May to NSC RP CultuRisk Tech Talks and monthly meetings. CultuRisk Tech Talks is a member-driven knowledge sharing and engagement initiative which began in September 2021, and it aligns with the ICOMOS India Strategic Plan and MOA, and it is conducted on second Saturday of every month. We will begin our talk in a while. Allow me to gently remind you of a few ground rules as shown in the slide. Thank you. Right. It is my honor and privileged to invite on this day, on this very humble forum, an expert professional and member of our committee, Dr. Arun Menon. Dr. Arun Menon holds a first degree in architecture and PhD in earthquake engineering from University of Pavia, Italy, Rose School. Currently, he is an associate professor of structural engineering at IIT Madras and coordinates the activities of National Center for the Safety of Heritage Structures, NCHSH, a Ministry of Education, Government of India supported research center at IIT Madras. He has been an expert member on the International Coordinating Committee for the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bagan, Myanmar, and is a member expert advisory group to the International Conservation Committee for Wat Phao UNESCO World Heritage Site in Laos, PDI. He is a member of the Bureau of Indian Standards for Masonry, CED 46P7, and Earthquake Engineering Sectional Committee, CED 39. At present, Dr. Arun is also the National Scientific Counselor of ICOMOS India and an expert member of ISCARSA, the International Scientific Committee on Analysis and Restoration of Structures of Architectural Heritage. In today's talk, Dr. Arun will share his learnings from Bagan after the M6.8 Chauk earthquake of 24th August 2016 in Myanmar, during which 389 monuments were damaged in the Bagan Archaeological Zone. Bagan, which is inscribed in the UNESCO World Heritage List in July 2019, has an extensive inventory of clay, brick, and stone masonry structures, including stupas, temples, and others. In the Chauk earthquake, out of 389 affected monuments, 89 were severely or moderately damaged, while 300 were affected in a minor way. Several efforts have been underway not only to restore the earthquake damaged monuments, but also to mitigate the risk of this site. Dr. Arun will elaborate on his current engagement in a long-term project to reduce the earthquake losses in this priceless archaeological site affected by recurrent earthquakes. I thank you very much, Dr. Arun, for taking time out for giving us this tech talk, and hand over the virtual floor to you.
Thank you, Priyanka, for the introduction. And thanks to both of you, Shahzad and Priyanka, for hosting these talks so meticulously every month, every second Saturday. And I'm sure the dialogue that's happening within the NSC is really giving an opportunity for thinking on new lines, and that's the whole idea of having these talks within the NSC. So I'm grateful that you've given me this opportunity today, and I have this little presentation on the experience from Bagan that I thought I'll share with all of you. This is a sort of a work in progress from 2016, when I was involved after the earthquake of 2016. But it's such a historic site with so many layers of culture, and is a site that's been affected by earthquakes for a very long period of time. In the sense, there is a documented history of severe earthquakes in this region, and the huge stock of heritage structures, which in 2019 was declared as a World Heritage Site, continues to be at risk primarily because of earthquakes, but there are of course other risks as well. One of the important risks that you want to think about today is it's become a World Heritage Site, and you can imagine the increase in the footfalls of tourists that's going to happen in the next few decades, very much like places like Siem Reap in Cambodia and Machu Picchu, which see a very, very large number of tourists and effects because of the amount of pressure that the tourist infrastructure starts putting on these sites. We're not there yet. In 2019, Bagan became a World Heritage Site. In 2020, we had the pandemic, and so it's been just completely silent after that. And then in 2021, as you know, the civil war in Myanmar began, and so it's been the military regime is back. So it's been a tough period that way for a country like Myanmar, but as things come back to some normalcy, we will see a huge influx of tourists in this site for sure. And so that's within the context of what we talk of the risk to the site, different risks to the site. This is a site that potentially can have a lot of risks added to its existing list of risks. So let me just get into the presentation. The idea of this presentation is to look at the disaster management cycle within this particular site. It's very interesting that we talk of the disaster management cycle, be it any natural disaster or human-made disaster. It's always cyclic, and particularly with natural disasters, there is a certain rhythm with which these occur over a period of time. So as in this particular presentation, I'm focusing on earthquakes, and it's really the time that one gets between two earthquakes to protect the site as much as possible so that it is better prepared to face the next earthquake, minimizing potential losses. So that's really the intent of this talk, to see what's really happening in Bagan, and are we headed in the right direction. So you have basically the capacity building phase and the emergency response phase. So immediately after an earthquake, you are into the response phase, where there are safety evaluation protocols to be followed, short-term countermeasures are taken. You get into the recovery mode, and then this could take a few years by itself. You're in the emergency response and reconstruction phase. You slowly move towards repair and retrofit through detailed damage assessment. And then you are possibly out of the emergency response phase. You get into the next phase, which is actually the capacity building phase. And in the capacity building phase, you're doing mitigation and preparation. And this needs to be, particularly for sites such as Bagan, where there is a significant earthquake hazard. It's about being prepared for the next event, well in time for the next event, because the next event is just around the corner. So it's in this context that I'm talking of different things that happened after 2016 in Bagan. So it's called the Bagan Archaeological Park, and it's actually was the capital city of the Mandalay region. And constructions were made in this place between the 9th and the 13th century. And there's actual archaeological evidence of about 10,000 structures built in this place. And the area is about 13 by 8 square kilometers. So this is centered around Old Bagan, and you have all these monuments. Today, of course, you don't have 10,000, you have about 2,000 to 3,000, which have been identified and listed. That's a picture showing you the different monuments marked, geographically with their geographical coordinates. There are different zones identified for the surveying, and then the important thing is these sites are sitting on the banks of the Irrawaddy River, which means you have rich alluvium deposits on which these monuments are built, and that's also the reason why these monuments are built in clay brick masonry, because you have a good source of clay, and all these monuments have been built in clay brick, burnt clay brick, and very few monuments have been built with sandstone. It's a very small number of monuments with stone. Most of them are clay brick masonry constructions. One fantastic aspect of the Bagan Archaeological Park is the phenomenal work that was conducted by the French Institute, EFEO, and UNESCO spearheaded by an architect by the name Priyanka, who, after the 1975 earthquake, and I'll talk to you about it in a moment, 1975 earthquake documents the entire site, and basically in 8 volumes has covered the 2,834 monuments with photographs, plans, sections, elevations. I mean, this is a heritage by itself. The voluminous work conducted by Priyanka and his team and published by UNESCO in 1992. So this is something, the inventory of monuments is something phenomenal that is present at this site. In terms of the structural typologies, we're looking at a vast majority of Buddhist temples, and there are a large number of stupas and few monasteries. And in terms of their structure, they're all brick masonry constructions. They're massive constructions. Some of them are 3, 4 multi-storied constructions. Some of them are just solid stupas. The temples have different features. Some of them have a central vertical core on which the spire sits. Some of them do not have these cores. Instead, they just have vaulted roofs on which the spire sits. So there's a classification of the structural typologies in the site between the stupas, the Buddhist temples, and the monasteries. But all of them, as I said, 99% of them would be brick masonry, clay brick masonry with mud mortar constructions. About 450 to 500 of them have mural paintings. So it's a huge number of monuments with very intricate mural paintings all the way from the 11th century to the 18th century. So you have extensive mural painting in many of these constructions, and also incised plaster work online in many of these sites. In the recent past, Bagan was affected by 2 earthquakes. Of course, in the last 700, 800 years, there have been innumerable earthquakes. The 1975 earthquake is well documented, and the 2016 earthquake, 41 years later, is also very well documented. And these happened almost at the same site, quite close to the same site. The 2 earthquakes are also comparable in their magnitudes. The Bagan 1975 earthquake about magnitude 6.5, whereas the Chalk earthquake, the epicenter was at a place called Chalk of magnitude 6.8. The records, the historical records about the 1975 earthquake show that the damage in the 2 earthquakes are also comparable. So you can almost imagine that this place is going to be affected every 40, 50 years by a significant earthquake, right? After the 2016 earthquake, 389 was the number that originally was recorded, but then that number grew to about 404. And today we have about 3,600 odd monuments that are listed, which means almost 10% or more of the monuments were affected. And out of this 10%, about another 10% of the affected monuments were critically affected. So about 40 out of 400, out of a 3,600 stock was the one that was really affected. Post-earthquake reconnaissance was done from the 24th August to the 9th of September. And of course, this happens in stages, and more detailed reconnaissance is conducted over time. And detailed surveys are required before interventions are even carried out. So the picture that you see on the left is basically showing you the red, green, and yellow tags distribution of the monuments. The red meaning severely damaged and structurally compromised. The yellow tags meaning there is some damage and care should be taken if these monuments have to be used, and the green tag meaning the damage is quite minimal. Of course, as I said, before deciding what interventions, you might have to first do a rapid assessment followed by a detailed assessment to understand the type of damage, and then you have to do a little more detailed assessment to be able to design some structural interventions. They may be immediate interventions, emergency stabilization that you do originally, but then as you start doing detailed interventions, detailed assessments, the idea is that the emergency stabilization is slowly removed and the main interventions are carried out. And this can take a few years. It can go from 5 years to about 10 years that you're really doing the detailed assessment and intervention strategy. So the detailed assessment then leads to a rehabilitation strategy, and you need to have funds. Imagine if you have a site where 400 monuments are affected, and the rest of the monuments also require daily care and maintenance protocols, but 400 of them really require interventions, which may be of the budget of a given Department of Archaeology. So it's not that straightforward. It gets extended over time. And today we are about 6 years from the earthquake, and interventions are still being carried out in many of these structures. Of course, this has to be implemented and executed over a period of time, and the quality of the work is also extremely important, because we're talking of and it's interesting because in 2016, when this site was affected by the earthquake, the site was actually preparing the dossier. The department was preparing the dossier for the World Heritage nomination. So it was a very critical phase. And then comes the earthquake, which means a number of structures have been affected. And then the problem is they were in a hurry to do the repairs because the nomination process was underway. So the UNESCO and the experts working there really told them, look, you have to go slow, because if you were to carry out repairs and compromise the authenticity of these sites, the nomination process might get compromised. And this was the second time that Bagan was coming up for nomination. The first one, they were asked to put it off. The second one was affected by the earthquake. Anyway, the process was slowed down, and they did it in a much more meticulous manner, taking care that hurried interventions are avoided, so that the authenticity of the site and historicity of the site is not compromised. And therefore, now they are on a track for, and the 2019 nomination went favorably for Bagan. So it was a period of high tension for the Department of Archaeology. This is the second site in Myanmar that gets the World Heritage tag. Now, the point is, if it's a site that's actually been affected by earthquakes, and then, recurrently, and then you need to take care of so many monuments, it means that in the peacetime, so we were looking at two halves of that sketch, of that flow chart. In the upper half is the peacetime, and the lower half is the wartime, because that's when you're immediately after an earthquake, it's emergency response. In the peacetime is when you can actually develop guidelines for temporary structural stabilization, improve your methods for rapid visual screening, do assessments, and so on, so that you're ready. And once the event happens, you have protocols, you have trained personnel who can actually help to act on the site, particularly when you have such a large stock of monuments. So this is actually a peacetime exercise, but then, since a systematic process was not in place after the 2016 earthquake, UNESCO had to fund a process so that they can consolidate guidelines for post-earthquake temporary structural stabilization. Similarly, rapid visual screening forms. In fact, there were many rapid visual screening forms that were being prepared by multiple countries, but it was not all. It was not focused on earthquake damage. It was focused on basic structural situation, mural conditions, and so on. So they didn't have an RVS form or rapid visual screening form which could be used immediately. So these are in the phases of the disaster management and mitigation cycle, these are the activities that should really happen during the peacetime, so that you're ready with protocols and training for the event itself. Of course, this should not be only for earthquakes. This should be for different hazards that a site can actually be affected by, natural hazards or human-made hazards. Of course, this slide that you can see here is my initial work, which was to look at 39 monuments that they had identified as critical monuments, both from its importance and from the amount of damage. And the work there in the initial days after the earthquake was to be able to classify them into red, green, and yellow. So red, yellow, and green. Red meaning immediate structural interventions are required, temporary stabilization, and nobody should be able to enter those monuments because safety is compromised. Orange is you can enter, you can do your surveys with care, and green is there is damage, but it has not compromised the stability of those spaces. So this was an initial work for 39 monuments, which was then extended to the 400 monuments that I was talking about earlier. So moving on in the different phases of the disaster management cycle, you're in the lower half, as I said, response phase. Salvage operations have to begin. You can see the kind of damage. Number of spires were very badly affected. Many spires collapsed, which means you couldn't go anywhere near the spires collapsing. In many of these stupas, the spire was precariously hanging. So this gives you an overview of the sort of damage, and you can imagine over 400 monuments if such sort of a damage is happening, how to tackle this at a site. Simple issues like this one particular example that I'm showing you, Mingala Zedi, was a stupa where the top of the spire had literally rocked and was about to fall. You can see the damage at the base of this. But then the upper portion was completely intact. Now, this had to be removed because it could fall anytime in an aftershock, or if repairs had to be done, this had to be removed. So this was problematic, and this required a lot of thinking whether a crane can be used and so on. And in fact, in this particular case, when we looked at the size of this and we looked at the capacity of a crane and the overall dimensions of the monument, we were not able to find a crane that would actually be able to handle this 45 ton, I think it was about 45 tons, 43 tons of solid material in one piece intact, but its base completely gone. So this had to be, we wanted to see if a crane could be used to remove this, but there was no way we could do that because of the size of the monument, height of the monument, and the weight of the single piece which had to be removed. So basically this had to be broken by hand. Over a few months, it had to be dismantled. Then emergency stabilization, you get into looking at monument by monument, the kind of damage each monument is showing and the kind of repairs that each of them, the repairs meaning the stabilization each of them would require. This just gives you an overview. Different types of techniques would be required depending on the type of damage. The training that the team is executing it for designing and for executing it is important. Site supervision and short-term monitoring is also important in such situations, because if done with a poor understanding, it can actually cause further damage in an aftershock, or even in incidents of rains, you can have sudden collapses because of rainwater going into the structure and affecting the equilibrium. Moving forward, here's an example of how a corner support system had to be designed and then executed by the members of the civil works team. Here you can see a huge spire. At the base of the spire, there were PT cables, post-tension cables that were actually basically trying to confine the monument from all the four sides. But these PT cables have to be taut, and if these PT cables are not taut and they slack off, they're really ineffective. They're really ineffective in being able to hold the confine the structure. So it requires monitoring over time. Some damage locations, as soon as you see the damage, you try to put in some monitoring devices so that over time you have information on whether things are improving or stabilizing or worsening over a period of the monitoring phase. But what's interesting is the amount of indigenous skill that is also present. You can see how these structures are immediately provided with weather protection, temporary weather protection, and that's with bamboo. That's with bamboo all the way up. It's almost like this crochet work that they would do. Hundreds of people would just come onto the monument, climb over the monument, and in a few hours set up this entire temporary support system, temporary weather protection system. And the temporary weather protection system really protects the area because of the Irrawaddy plains. You have heavy breeze and showers. So this can actually affect cracked portions of these buildings. And so all these spires had these nice crocheted hats that they were put up with to protect these constructions. So a lot of indigenous skill and a lot of human resource available to be able to do such things. As we move forward in the BMM phase, institutions like the UNESCO and several other countries would then come in and say, okay, we'll do a pilot project, we'll pick up an example, we'll take you through all the specific phases that you must rigorously do, and then get money through donors for executing it. So this is one example. UNESCO wanted to do one pilot project after the 2016 earthquake. Monument 2162 was one with a lot of mural paintings. In fact, a very interesting monument because in 1975 earthquake, it was damaged and interventions were carried out in the form of reinforced concrete bands, but they did not complete putting the bands in all the floors of the structure. because of which in the 2016 earthquake, the upper floor of the structure got damaged while the lower floor was salvaged. The floor with the murals was salvaged, but the floor above got very badly damaged. So then UNESCO put together a team, a multidisciplinary team to prepare the DPR for this particular as a pilot exercise. So this is a few pictures of the monument. You can see the this is considered to be the Sistine Chapel of Bagan. You can see the extensive mural work and then the sort of damage that has happened to the structure. You can see this is the ground story of the structure. You can see some new bricks, a band of new bricks. In fact, what really happens is at the ground story, reinforced concrete tie beam was introduced as a confining tie beam to protect the monument after the 1975 earthquake. As per design, these tie beams are supposed to be put at the two upper floors as well, but was never executed. So in the 2016 earthquake, the upper stories suffered damage, the lower stories were protected. So you see, unless things are completed, you have further complications that can happen in sites like this. So this was taken up as a pilot project. Detailed studies were carried out. Several countries were participating. This was just before the earthquake, very well documented by SIARC in the US, I mean SIARC in Canada. And you had this detailed documentation which could be used for earthquake analysis. So we tried to understand the construction features, and then we were involved in doing the seismic analysis part, and an Indian company, architect Gurmeet Rai's CRCI, was involved in preparing the conservation management plan. And there were mural specialists from Italy and so on. So it was a multidisciplinary team. So structural modeling is done. So it's one specific monument. So we tried to spend time and do something in a very detailed manner. And then we worked out, what if we propose putting a reinforced concrete beam in the upper story, or should we go with a steel exposed tie and not put reinforced concrete because of compatibility issues? So we worked out different options and demonstrated that the intervention at the upper stories is a critical intervention and what could be done, and gave options. And finally, this is currently under restoration, and despite the problems of the pandemic and the civil unrest that's happening there because of the regime change, work is progressing, and now they've reached the structural rehabilitation phase of this project. And you can actually see the indigenous knowledge in coming up with the weather protection system, which is conscious of the heavy winds that come to these areas. So you can see that there are these openings that will prevent the weather protection system from just getting blown away. So work is underway in this particular pilot project. So that was a 6-month project. So I just want to close by giving you this an idea of this project that's currently running. So 2016, the earthquake happens. UNESCO wants to do a pilot project and thus starts that in 2017. And it's a 6-month project. At the end of the 6-month project, all the estimates and everything is ready for the work for the procurement and the work to start on the ground. Multidisciplinary project was conducted. The work did not immediately take off because of several issues, but is going to begin. So the amount of time available for research and development was about 6 months immediately after the earthquake. But then a place like Bagan has a number of foreign agencies that would come in. And one of the prominent foreign agencies that have come in is the Getty Conservation Institute. So the Getty Conservation Institute, the interest of the Getty Conservation Institute was to do a long-term capacity building and pick up one monument as a demonstrative monument and carry out the complete intervention itself. But before the intervention, a 5-6 year period is dedicated to research. So you see a different scale of mitigation activity that is happening now, that is slow-paced, much more rigorous, and at the end aims at transferring this new knowledge that has been gathered over a 5-6 year period to risk reduction in the entire site. So this is one project that we are involved in currently with the Getty Conservation Institute, where multiple tasks have been developed and multiple monuments are being looked at in a very detailed manner so that we can at the end of the project, be able to retrofit one monument, but also be able to give an idea of how the site can be tackled, given that there are such a large number of monuments in the site. So this is a huge team. We have seismological aspects, we have structural aspects that we are dealing with, but then the Getty Conservation Project looks at many other things. There's a mural team, there is a capacity building team, and so on. So this is what you're seeing here is only IIT Madras team, which is working on the seismic analysis with Getty Conservation Institute and the Department of Archaeology. So here what's basically done is we have looked at statistics of the structural typologies, and then we've decided to narrow down to two important parameters. I'm going to wind up in a couple of minutes, so sorry that I've exceeded the time. Two important parameters. One parameter is the plan symmetry in these constructions, the symmetry in the plan layout, and vertical continuity, whether the spire has a vertical continuity all the way to the ground through a central tower, through a central core. We found that these two are the most critical parameters that dictated the earthquake behavior of Bagan's monuments. So we made a classification based on whether the structure it has a symmetry in plan and whether it has vertical continuity. A second category, there is, so you can see symmetry in plan and vertical continuity. The central core is there. A second category, symmetry in plan, no vertical continuity. A third category, no symmetry in plan because of this extension, but there is vertical continuity. And a fourth category, there is neither plan symmetry nor vertical continuity. And then we looked at all the monuments in Bagan and found that about, so you see H1V1, H0V1, H1V0 and H0V0 are the four categories. And you can see the distribution of Bagan monuments, about 43%, 33%, 22%, and 2%. So we got an idea that you could very nicely classify all the monuments in Bagan in these categories. And then of these four categories, we've taken one example in each, one representative example in each, and we're doing a very detailed study of each of them. So for the first one, we have picked up this monument 1493. Each monument has a number because of the large number of monuments there. You can see that the monument here called Mintiagu MPG for short, and each under each category, we are studying one monument in a detailed manner. So in 2020, just before the pandemic shutdown and all that started, we had done a very detailed field investigation, non-destructive testing on the structure. We had done velocity measurements through the different parts of the structure. We had done what's called tomography, like the CT scan that we do for the human body. This is a CT scan for a tomographic scan for a cross section of the central core. What you're seeing is the velocity contours in that core. So we've done a detailed field investigation of one monument. We were meant to do it for all the four representative monuments, but we could do only one because 2020 February, March, the lockdowns began. So we completed this. We've taken up detailed studies of each of them. Only for this one, we have detailed field information, whereas for the others, we only have geometrical data, not the material information. Anyway, the project is going on despite the complications. You can actually see the structural analysis on this, and we sort of did structural analysis to replicate the damage. So you can see the kind of damage to the spire that happened in the 2016 earthquake, and the structural model was able to capture that sort of a mechanism. So the idea is for each of these monuments, we go deeper, understand the behavior, and then understand how these typologies independently behave to then scale it up to the entire site. That's the whole idea of this particular project. So that's just a concluding slide, which shows how for different, so the H1V1, H0V1, H1V0, and H0V0, the detailed models you can see, and we are trying to understand the different structural features and the kind of behavior each one of them would have under different, under the earthquake action, and what strategies should we take for each of these typologies broadly. And that is a starting point for planning interventions at a much more larger scale at the site. This is just to say that it is not about just 4 independent monuments of those typologies, but the idea is to extend it to the 2,000 odd, 3,000 odd monuments that are there at the site. We're also trying to take it forward in terms of the seismic vulnerability assessment of the entire archaeological zone. We're trying to create methods to be able to do that. So you identify and prioritize monuments which need interventions, which did not get damaged in the previous earthquake. So that's the intent of the exercise. And that's how, if you are able to identify monuments which are vulnerable, which have not been damaged in the previous earthquakes, and then plan interventions in them, you will be able to reduce the risk of the site over time. So that's the whole intent. So it's within this cycle. So, we are currently in the mitigation phase. There are some repairs happening in some of these sites, but we are actually working on risk reduction through mitigation exercises in preparation for the next event. We're already, I would say 2016, it's 2022, 6 years down the line already. And in 40, 50 years, definitely the site is going to see another important earthquake. So there's not much time before the next event occurs. So I think with that, I'll stop. I just wanted to give you an overview of the different phases that typically occur in large archaeological sites such as this, where the luxury of resources sometimes is available and sometimes is not. But we have the special problem of the pandemic and the military regime creating complications, which we never expected. We were actually going to go back to the monument and complete the detailed investigations for the second, third, and the fourth typologies, which is not happening now. So yes, despite these complications, some important learning is there, and that's probably going to help us move forward. I'll stop there. Thank you. I've exceeded the time given to me. I'm sorry about that.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for talking to us about managing this very large scale of site. I can imagine how overwhelming it must have been, but there are so many beautiful structures, and it's amazing to see indigenous skills and the extensive work that you have done. It really brings out to me the importance of recording and inventorizing mainly, and doing it properly in stages. Thank you so much. I'll open the floor for questions if there are any.
Can I ask? No questions, but just some discussions which I would also like to do. Okay, first thing, I will go the way Arun presented. The first thing, discussions about authenticity, because I think that is something we have been facing. This site was an archaeological and a monumental site, but I think the questions of authenticity continuously with cities like Ahmedabad, or where things are, the change is the only constant. How do we look at authenticity? Do we still stick to that old definition of authenticity, and or do we see some difference or see situational changes? We did address this issue when we were addressing GA 2017 in India, where we put this whole document about the Delhi Declaration, which was saying that authenticity, especially in these South Asian countries, should be looked at differently. So, that is one discussion, and I don't know what Arun thinks about it, but that is one discussion I feel does require a lot of attention now, because we are starting looking, especially in India right now, we are starting to look at heritage, now. And all the European countries had already started looking at them back in 1950s, 1960s. So the authenticity of structures has changed.
This is, if you look at our context and then look at the international context, I think even internationally, authenticity is overrated. One has to really understand that you can actually give due attention to authenticity and try to, carry out interventions which
some practical balance, yes, which needs to be found, I think.
It's possible. It's possible, but then the design interventions and the cost and all that starts becoming phenomenal, and we're not about. So in reality, one has to that there is a limitation in terms of the justice we can do to authenticity and historicity in living sites. And if it's an archaeological site, there is still a possibility of freezing the space in time and protecting it and keeping it. But if it's a living site, there are important challenges. And Bagan is a living site. Bagan is a living site, and of course there are quite a sizable number of monuments which are archaeological sites, but still there's a large number which is living. Okay, and when you have hundreds of thousands of people visiting these sites, safety becomes an important thing. And then it's
when we look at Virupaksha temple in Hampi, when we had visited that back in, I think, 2003-04, the things are still starting, and it was a completely working site. And now when we went in, I think 2017, the whole life, the temple is functioning, but the life which was there on the street in front of the thing, how much sense does it make to not let the people there? And the whole life which was there as a living monument. So, I sometimes do question these things.
True. In a site like the in a site like the Virupaksha temple, which is not a living temple, these have been maintained as archaeological sites. The interventions in the archaeological site versus the interventions around the archaeological site, they need to be addressed in different manners. Here, when we're talking of interventions on the monument, the complication of the monument being a living monument versus an archaeological monument means approaches have to be different.
Virupaksha is a worshipping temple. No? People visit there regularly. It's in worship.
Virupaksha, yes.
Vittala is not in worship. Virupaksha is in worship.
The Vittala temple is not. So in a living temple, I'm specifically speaking of the interventions.
Yes.
The interventions in living versus an archaeological site. An archaeological site, you can freeze it and then say leave things as they are. But in living temples, you don't have the luxury of doing that. So it needs fresh thinking, and
when it is valued. One, it is at the point of when you're looking at intervention. The other thing is the point when they are valued against the other World Heritage sites, and when you're valuing them against authenticity. I think the reason should also be valued, that a certain intervention is done, because otherwise the site would be lost.
Exactly. In Bagan, that's the case. You either protect the site or you don't have the site.
So I think when looking at the authenticity when they're weighing things should also not only be that tick marks kya chahiye hai, ye nahi hai, but the reasons behind doing certain interventions, because you might not have a choice there. And I remember, I was going through this when you were saying that upar ka pura you had to dismantle and do it. I was looking 2-3 days before I was going through, because I wanted to give a lecture, and I was looking at this World Heritage Site a video of Abu Sibyl when they had wanted to make the Aswan Dam and the huge amount of reconstruction and restoration efforts that they have done. They were bold enough to do it that early also, and they were very strict strictures that this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do, and yet they have maintained that whole authenticity, and yet the development happens. So
infrastructural development. It was a dam. You had to move it for a dam.
Aswan Dam ke liye, what they had done. So those kind of understanding somehow for the larger sites. Of course, you cannot do that for smaller sites or smaller reasons. It becomes financially
prohibitive.
But for the larger sites, I think this kind of I feel they were much bolder than us.
Of course.
And the third thing, which is more interesting to me as a professional, because when we are looking at this understanding of introducing RCC bands, because we are struggling with a lot of projects, and that where we say, you need to stick to authenticity and timber against RCC. Now, there's this one whole thought where we are saying that if you use timber, it can take jerks and the structure can be slightly stable. You allow a certain movement and then the structure becomes stable again. There is this another thought whereby we are saying that you need to make it rigid so that it does not give away. So, I mean, that is one thing interesting, because when you were talking about introducing the RCC bands, what if we use timber against RCC? Which one is, you feel, true experience? I mean, what do you feel? Because there are these two thoughts which are prevalent.
No, in these sites after the 1975 earthquake, there were detailed studies under the UNESCO that was done. And the proposal that UNESCO made in all these sites was on a pilot basis. They had taken up about 16 monuments, if I'm not wrong. And this is after 1975. They had taken up these monuments, and they had actually designed interventions, and all these interventions were in reinforced concrete. All these interventions were in
That is what I'm trying to understand. I mean, I'm coming from a very professional point of view, whereby how do we, I mean, when we are struggling this in practice, and when we say that because the longevity of the structure, historic structure, even though it is damaged, probably might be more than the RCC concrete which we might be using.
That point is definitely there, in the sense the known life of reinforced concrete is about 100, 150 years, because we've not experienced it more than that. And there are issues of corrosion that can create trouble. So the point is, there is an issue of incompatibility there between the historical material and the intervention material. But the approach with which it was done post 1975 is a meaningful approach. And what it has actually led to is those monuments which were retrofitted survived the 2016 earthquake. So the purpose was to keep those structures. Those structures are actually survived. There are few problems because of durability.
Instead of timber, RCC works much better in earthquake.
It again is contextual. In this particular place, you're looking at very large structures, and you might require large timber sections, and these timber sections are exposed to moisture, rainfall, and they're sitting in mud construction. Wherever you find such timber, they're sitting in mud construction, that is with mud mortar. They can be prone to termite attacks. So you have a very complex situation. And there, see, the only thing is the ICOMOS guideline says you can use whatever new material you want, as long as its efficacy is proven in terms of durability and effectiveness of structural interventions. So that's the whole, it boils down to that. And if you're able to do corrosion protection and prove that for 200 years, 300 years, this reinforced concrete is not going to get corroded, why not is the question. So, yeah.
I mean, whatever used there, and you definitely would have gone through a thorough analysis. I'm just coming from a professional, because these are 2 or 3 questions which we are
regularly facing.
Even when we are doing adaptive reuse, there is this to and fro with the client, because there are always budget issues with a private conservation project, and whereby you are saying that no, this is better and this is not better, and where do you balance? So that is, I mean, especially when you are saying earthquake, I wanted to understand the idea that I mean, how do you, what is better? Is timber and
you can design it. You can design it in timber. You can design it in reinforced concrete.
No, but the idea of allowing movement or providing
both will allow movement. Both will allow movement. The idea that reinforced concrete is rigid is not correct. It is hard, but it can deform.
It can allow movement.
It can deform. Yeah, it can allow movement. So it is about being able to choose a certain material and then structurally design it.
Work with it.
Exactly.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Amit, yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Yeah. So I have a question, and I'm coming from context of I went to Petra like last couple of weeks back, and I saw Bedouins over there, and I had a very good conversation with them. And within that conversation, I realized that with that whole World Heritage sites, Bedouins, who are the local people over there, are kind of being taken out of the site and removed from the space itself. And what Bedouins say that, okay, we are the main stakeholders, and we are the custodians of this place since hundreds of years. So I want to know from you, in your experience, how do we see people? Do we see them as a risk and vulnerability, or we see them as a capacity? And how we engage them in the process of preparedness as well as conservation?
Thanks. That's a very interesting but a very tough question. But I'll tell you, since we're speaking about Bagan today, I think the answer the answer lies on what sort of a government you have. Okay, and what happened in Bagan is when the military regime was active before the democratic phase, they issued an ordinance saying that the entire population living in the Bagan archaeological zone had to vacate. Okay, so a dictum was given that entire population spread around the Bagan archaeological zone leaves, and they created a new town called New Bagan and gave them all the amenities there and said, this is your place. Okay, the rest of the zone becomes Bagan archaeological zone. At that point in time, since the military asked them to do it, they went ahead and did that, okay, without complaining. But after some time, one realizes that it is actually good, because the fragmented development or new infrastructural development in this archaeological zone is almost absent today, and the new town is good, active, functional, has amenities, and for its economy depends on the archaeological zone. There are hotels that are being run. There are tourist guides who would come from the old Bagan, New Bagan to old Bagan to take the tourists around. There's an entire thriving economy from New Bagan, which is working in old Bagan. So I think it's a very interesting model. It would not have happened in a democracy. It happened there, but then you can see the positive impact of the decision. It's even with Siem Reap, it's the same condition. Even with Cambodia, it's the same condition. All the archaeological zones are just sanitized. Nobody can live there. But you have huge development that's happening on the fringe, on the outside, in the cities, and so on. So, and there's a population that is depending on the archaeological zone. So there is a certain sense of preservation that is dictating, and economy, keeping the economy functional, that is dictating such choices. So there are these interesting models. It might not happen so easily in democracies, but even in case of Petra, it's the same thing. They've built a new town, New Petra, and people just come in the morning and go back in the evening. And but I see that there is a resistance that this is our local habitat. This was a local habitat. We used to live in these caves. So when we see that living heritage, and the same thing is with Hampi, and we see this as a living heritage, and we take out people from there. So how do we see it as alive? Yeah. No, so then you're kind of freezing it in time and not allowing continuity in the site. You're not allowing continuity in the site. But then it is, a double-edged sword. You want to allow continuity in the site, or you want to preserve it and showcase it for the, So it's a very tricky situation to be in.
Yep. Great. And also one of the follow-up question about military coup over there. So now, from your experience, I don't know whether you have been able to visit now, since it's open for people to go. Okay. Anyway, so within the military coup, and not just before the military coup, before also there was a lot of resistance in the people and dissatisfaction among the people because of so many things. Now, within the larger socio-economic political scenario which functions in a society, from your experience in Bagan, how was the response of people to the heritage, priority-wise, with respect to heritage, than any other things which have been impacting them? It is livelihood, food, education, water, or is it the heritage which is important for them within the larger priority setting? What, in your experience of Bagan?
See, it's a living site, vast majority of the monuments there, a lot of Myanmaris go there to pray on a regular basis. They have their annual festivals, and all their religious activities still go on in Bagan. A large proportion of the monuments are archaeological monuments, but there are still, the most prominent ones are still living monuments. So this site is is considered sacred and very important by the local population. And the point is, a place like Bagan is thriving only because of the tourists coming there. only because of the pilgrims and the tourists coming there. And Bagan has an airport. Bagan has an airport, and in 2019, 2020, early 2020, before the pandemic, you had Bagan airport receiving about 15 to 20 flights a day. Plane loads of foreigners were coming to visit this place, and locals were also coming by all other means of transport to come to this place. So this is the backbone of the economy of the region, Mandalay region. And hence that's recognized, and it's also religious heritage. So it's right up there in terms of their priority. So just after the earthquake, every important monument had 1,000, 1,500 of the locals were just gathered there to pick up every shred of masonry that had fallen and salvage. Okay? So I think they're emotionally linked to the site, and they know that they exist because the site is there, and that respect continues. And you can see a very nice harmony there as far as this aspect is concerned.
Nice. One more follow-up question, probably last one from my side. One is tourism as a risk as well. The question comes from a space where what has happened in the larger heritage field, what I'm observing as probably a participant and from an outside perspective, that while in preserving of heritage, it was supposed to be, or it can be, preserving of the local indigenous knowledge, but what we are trying to preserve is the tourism. And somehow both the things might not go hand in hand, or probably they are on the opposite side of the sword. So whether is it restoring or preserving the knowledge, or is it preserving the tourism? And while tourism can itself be a risk,
again, this is important question, but it doesn't have easy answers at all. And in Bagan itself, you can see tourism for the sake of showcasing heritage. And activities that are basically showcasing heritage to the international population versus maintenance of the sites for their religious activities and other cultural activities actually happening. So see, it really depends on how the country is perceiving the site and is able to strike a balance between protection of their culture while ensuring that the culture is able to give them an economic sustenance in the site. If there is a sensitive balance that the governing authorities are able to create, it will happen. Otherwise, you'll see a picture which is a sellable picture, but it might really not have much to do with their real history. So far, so good. And I think the pandemic and the military, the shift in regime has sort of put brakes on the kind of development that was happening. 2019, it became a World Heritage Site, and several hotels had to be dismantled, demolished, and moved away from the archaeological zone. There were some illegal constructions that had begun, and because the UNESCO nomination had come, they had to start acting on those. And I think the pandemic and the regime change has put further brakes on this sort of uncontrolled development. You'll really have to see in the post-pandemic and post-regime change phase what's happening in that site. So far, no idea. I don't know if tourists have started going back to places like that.
Not tourists.
Not yet.
Only professionals. Some of the professionals. Thank you. Thanks a lot for all your responses and discussions.
Thank you for those questions.
Thank you. I was also trying to understand the situation in Bagan in comparison with Nepal, in Kathmandu, how different agencies came to fund projects post the earthquake. Did it happen similarly?
Yes, that happens. That happens in all these Asian, African sites. No, it's sort of a carry forward of the colonial mindset. That colonial mindset is over, and now you have these countries that are trying to patronize and say, look, we will bring money, we will bring So it's a different kind of colonization that's actually happening, and that happened shamelessly in Nepal, and that happens in Myanmar, so it also depends on the local politics, right? So the favoring China or India, favoring Japan or European countries, favoring the US or Europe. So there are internal dynamics, and that was a time when US had pulled out of UNESCO. So there was no way they were going to get they're not going to get a piece of the pie. The Chinese have been very aggressive in Myanmar, and so they've been pumping money in facilities. So a big chunk is with China, but India also jumped in, and India went and said, we will do 100 monuments, restoration of 100 monuments after the earthquake. They did one very nicely, and one important living monument. But after that, when they started their project for 100, that's when the pandemic struck. So work has just stopped.
But it is so nice to see SIARC coming in and providing those technological.
Yes. So there are multiple. So SIARC, and there's a South African company, I forget its name. So there are multiple agencies. You go to Bagan and you will have scientists and engineers and architects and archaeologists and art historians and conservators from all over the world who are working in these places, and that's interesting because there's a lot of exchange of ideas. It's a nice
exactly.
How is it coordinated? Because there are multiple stakeholders, and then there's coordination in emergencies are critical.
A mess. It's a mess. Immediately after the earthquake, and when all this focus started emerging again, even after 1975 to an extent that must have happened, but UNESCO and UNDP came into the picture and they said, we'll handle the whole thing. Whereas in this post 2016, Department of Archaeology and National Museums Myanmar government established the BICC, Bagan International Conservation Committee.
Okay.
And learning from Cambodia, they decided that they will Myanmar will head the BICC. In Cambodia, it's headed by France, by the UNESCO. Okay. So here they said, no, we will be the bosses here. And so a good process was set in place. It's a pity that the double whammy of the pandemic and the regime change has come in. But things were moving in the right direction, I would think. There were at least 7-8 countries working set up in 2019 and 20.
Nice. Interesting.
Right. I will invite Shahzad to conclude with a thank you.
On behalf of NSC RP, my coordinator, and all other members, I thank Dr. Arun for presenting such a elaborative study in front of us members. It was really interesting to see, and we have the PDF, and I am going to show this to my students as well, just to understand the risk and the challenges behind such a vast site. So once again, thank you to Dr. Arun for presenting and taking out time from his busy schedule, and to both the members, Poonam ma'am and Amit as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahzad, for your kind words.
Thank you.